The bride was sent to the wrong ranch, but the little girl clung to her skirt and whispered, "God finally sent you to us." From the very first moment, that single line cut through the howl of a Montana winter like a prayer. Snow swirled in blinding sheets across the open prairie, burying trails, silencing rivers, swallowing even the sky. Out here in the winter of 1869, a mistake wasn't just an inconvenience, it could cost a life. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The wind tore across the wide white plains, sharp as knives scraping against the wool of Eleanor Whitaker's shawl. She staggered forward, one hand clutching her small travel trunk, the other shielding her face from the cutting flurries. Her boots crunched over drifts, each step slower than the last. The sky had darkened gray, bleeding into indigo, and the only shape on the horizon was a shadow, a ranch house standing black against the storm. Eleanor drew her breath deep and forced her legs forward. The Missouri Matrimonial Agency had written her with instructions. Travel west, cross the snow plains, meet her future husband at Red Bluff Ranch. They had promised safety, stability, a husband waiting with open arms. She had clung to the letter through every rattling stagecoach mile, through every sleepless night of uncertainty. Now finally she stood at what must be Red Bluff Ranch. The house loomed dark, its windows flickering with a dull firelight smoke curling from a stone chimney. Her gloved hand shook as she reached for the door. Before her knuckles touched wood, the door creaked open and a man filled the frame. He was tall, broad-carved from the same stone that made the mountains. His hair was dark, his eyes gray as sleet, and his mouth was a line that had forgotten how to smile. The coat he wore swung open just enough for Eleanor to glimpse the revolver holstered at his side and the glint of a gold wedding band on his finger. His presence was steady, but his silence weighed heavy. Eleanor's throat tightened. She steadied her voice. "My name is Eleanor Whitaker," she said. "I was sent by the Missouri Matrimonial Agency. I'm to marry a Mr. Carter." The man blinked once. His jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough, as if unused. "My name is Gideon Hale," he said. "And I didn't order a bride." The words struck like cold water. Eleanor stood frozen, snow gusting into her back, her breath caught in the sudden silence. There must be some mistake, she managed, though her voice trembled. "The letter. It said this was Red Bluff Ranch." "This is Red Bluff, isn't it?" "It is," Gideon replied flatly. His eyes stayed on hers, hard searching. "But there's no Carter here. You've come to the wrong ranch." He turned half away, one hand already moving to close the door. Panic surged in Eleanor's chest. The last stagecoach had gone. The storm was rising. She had nowhere else to go. "Please," she said quickly, stepping forward before the door could shut. Her voice broke raw with desperation. "There's a storm coming, and I have nowhere else to go." Gideon hesitated, just for a fraction of a moment. His gaze lingered as if weighing not just her words, but her very soul. Then slowly he stepped aside. "You can come in," he said, voice still cold, but only for the night. Eleanor exhaled the weight of exhaustion, pressing her forward. She crossed the threshold, her trunk thumping against the wood floor. Heat from the stone fireplace washed over her skin, and she nearly wept from the relief. Inside the house was spare but solid. Rough-hewn furniture, thick beams holding the ceiling, and walls that whispered of years without laughter. Eleanor set her trunk by the door and glanced around. Near the fireplace sat a child's wooden horse abandoned in the dust. Beside the door, a small bonnet hung next to a rifle, and above the mantel, half dusted, was a woman's portrait hair, pinned high, face delicate yet unsmiling. Gideon followed her gaze. His voice was stiff. "She passed 3 years ago. My wife." Eleanor turned back to him, her heart heavy. "I did not come here to replace anyone," she said softly. I have nowhere else to be." He said nothing. His silence was heavier than words. Then he motioned down the hallway. "You can sleep there tonight. In the morning, I'll take you back to Fort Bridger." Her throat ached with protest, but her body was too tired to argue. She nodded and turned toward the hallway. Then it happened. Soft footsteps so small they barely touched the floor. Both adults froze. Out of the shadows of the adjoining room, a little figure emerged, a girl no more than 5 years old, barefoot in a faded blue nightdress. Her dark hair hung in tangles, her eyes wide and pale, as though they had seen too much. Gideon stiffened his hand, twitching toward his side, not for his gun, but for steadiness. His lips parted soundlessly as the child walked straight to Eleanor. Not a word was spoken. The girl reached out small fingers, clutching the edge of Eleanor's skirt. Then in a voice fragile from years of silence, she whispered, "God finally sent you to us." The room went still. The fire popped in the hearth. Gideon's breath caught sharp in his chest. His knees bent slowly and his rough hands trembled as he looked at the girl. "Clara," he whispered hoarsely, You spoke." The little girl pressed her cheek against Eleanor's skirt, clutching tighter. "Are you going to leave too?" she asked, voice barely audible. Eleanor's heart cracked like thin ice. She knelt, meeting the child's eyes, her own filling with warmth. She touched Clara's cheek gently. "No, sweetheart," she said. "Not tonight." Behind them, Gideon's hands clenched at his sides. His gray eyes flickered with something he hadn't felt in years, hope and fear tangled together. For the first time since she arrived, his voice softened. "Stay," he said quietly, "at least until the storm passes." Eleanor nodded once, but deep inside she knew the storm had already come, and she was already inside it. The storm did not break that night. It roared against the rafters like a living beast, rattling shutters, pressing icy fingers through cracks in the wood. Inside the Hale ranch house glowed dimly its firelight, holding the darkness at bay. Eleanor lay awake in the small spare room, every creak of the walls echoing in her chest. She could still feel the weight of Clara's tiny hands on her skirt, the tremor in her voice when she whispered that impossible sentence, "God finally sent you to us." Sleep would not come. Eleanor rose, wrapping her shawl tighter, and stepped into the hallway. The house smelled faintly of smoke and cedar undercut by something older dust and silence, the scent of rooms that hadn't laughed in years. She passed the parlor and paused. On the mantel, the portrait of Gideon's wife seemed to watch her. Eleanor's gaze lingered. The woman's face was proud, distant, caught in an expression that revealed little but carried weight. The gold frame around it was dull with dust. How long since anyone had touched it? The floor creaked behind her. Gideon's figure filled the doorway. Tall shoulders squared his presence, both a comfort and a warning. "You should sleep," he said quietly. Eleanor turned. "So should you." He gave no answer, only moved past her to add another log to the fire. Sparks leapt, shadows stretching long across the room. His movements were precise, practiced like a man who lived by ritual. Every gesture, every silence carried the echo of years alone. Eleanor wanted to ask about Clara, about the years since his wife had gone, but the words felt fragile, too sharp to risk breaking this uneasy truce. Instead, she said softly, "Your daughter. She hasn't spoken in a long time, has she?" Gideon's hand stilled on the poker. He stared into the flames. "Not since the night Eliza disappeared," he said. His voice was flat, but beneath it ran a tremor, a thread of grief that could not be hidden. Eleanor's breath caught. She wanted to ask more, but Gideon's shoulders had already tightened, his silence shutting her out. When she returned to her room, she found Clara curled asleep on the braided rug just inside her door, as if afraid she would vanish in the night. Eleanor lifted the child gently, laying her in the small bed, pulling the quilt to her chin. Clara stirred only once, murmuring something inaudible, then settled back into sleep. The days that followed blurred into one long storm. The snow deepened, burying the ranch beneath white silence. Roads vanished, trails closed. Gideon announced matter-of-factly that she would remain until it cleared. Eleanor accepted without protest. She had nowhere else to go, and the truth was Clara's eyes had already bound her more tightly than any contract from the matrimonial agency ever could. The house revealed itself slowly. Eleanor noticed the little things, a piano in the parlor, its keys yellowing, its lid never lifted. A child's toy horse abandoned near the hearth, worn smooth by years of play, and then silence. A faded blue dress hanging in the wardrobe of her guest room, stitched with care, clearly once cherished. At first, Gideon spoke to her only in short, practical sentences. "The kettle leaks. Don't use it. Barn door sticks. Don't push it." His words were stone, but his actions betrayed him. He fixed the kettle handle after noticing her struggle. He nailed down the drafty window panel in her room. He stacked extra logs by the hearth before she rose each morning, all without a word. Eleanor noticed, and she understood. These weren't kindnesses offered lightly. They were the habits of a man who repaired what was broken, not for thanks, but because leaving things broken was unbearable. Clara, meanwhile, began to hover at the edges of rooms. She followed Eleanor with watchful eyes, ragdoll clutched tightly in her hands. She said nothing, but her silence was not emptiness anymore. It was attention. One afternoon, as Eleanor mended a glove by the window, Clara crept forward and set a folded piece of paper beside her. Then the child scurried back like a small bird. Eleanor opened it carefully. A drawing. Crude stick figures, one tall man, one yellow-haired woman, and a child between them holding both their hands. Above them a bright sun, and scrawled in clumsy letters the word, Mama. Eleanor's throat ached. She pressed the paper to her chest. When she looked up, Clara was gone, but the sound of her small footsteps lingered in the hall. The next morning, Clara brought a crooked plate of biscuits, half burned, half raw. They smelled of smoke and flour. Eleanor ate each one as if it were a feast, praising them like treasures. For the first time, Clara smiled, uncertain, small, but real. By the week's end, the girl was climbing into Eleanor's lap by the window, curling there with her doll, listening as Eleanor read from a worn Bible she'd found on the shelf. Clara didn't understand every word, but she listened with rapt attention, her fingers playing with the edge of Eleanor's sleeve. Through the window, Gideon watched them, once his figure framed in the pale winter light. His eyes lingered, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The sight spoke for him. But under every soft moment lay something heavier. Eleanor felt it in Gideon's silences, in the way his hand sometimes twitched at his side, in the shadows that passed through Clara's gaze. Something remained unspoken, unhealed. It came to her one morning in the simplest of ways. Gideon had gone to the barn. Eleanor was tidying her room, folding shawls, when she spotted an envelope tucked beneath the blankets of the trunk she had set aside. At first she thought it was her own, but when she opened it, she saw it wasn't addressed to her. The letter was short, written in a doctor's hand. Her injuries have healed well enough. She may live a long and healthy life. However, the trauma to her abdomen has caused lasting damage. The likelihood of childbearing is minimal to none. Her hands trembled. She remembered the hospital tents during the war, the explosion, the searing pain across her ribs, the nurse who told her she'd been lucky to live, the part they hadn't told her she'd known anyway, that no child would ever grow inside her body. She folded the letter back, pressing it flat, but when she looked up, she saw Gideon standing in the doorway. He had come in silently. The letter was still in her hands. Their eyes locked. Silence pressed heavier than the storm outside. The fire in the hearth had burned low embers, glowing like wounded stars. Gideon stood in the doorway, his broad frame shadowing the flicker of light, his eyes fixed on the letter Eleanor still clutched in her trembling hands. His jaw worked hard as stone, but his voice came quieter than she expected. "I found that today," he said. Eleanor's heart lurched. She set the letter gently on the small table beside her as though it were fragile glass. "You read it?" "I did." Silence fell. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the chest, that demanded truth no matter how much it hurt. Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze. "I was a nurse," she began, her voice a whisper. "During the war." "Not by training, by necessity. We had no choice." Gideon stepped further into the room, but did not sit. He waited, watching her with the stillness of a man who had weathered storms by letting them pass. "There was a boy." Eleanor continued, her fingers knotting in her skirt. "No more than 8. His mother carried him in, wrapped in a Union flag. She held him as if he was still breathing." Eleanor's voice broke. "But he wasn't. He was gone before he reached us." Her throat closed. She had never spoken of it, not once, not in all the years since. Every night after that, she whispered, "I dreamed of his face." And then, the explosion. Her hand instinctively pressed to her side over the faint ache of scar tissue that would never fully heal. "They said I was lucky to survive." But the damage was done. Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "I will never have children of my own." The admission hung between them like smoke. She expected pity, or worse, cold judgment, but Gideon's eyes did not waver. "You saved lives," he said quietly, "and you paid a price most men couldn't bear." Eleanor blinked, startled. "I don't want your sympathy." "You don't have it," Gideon replied. His voice was firm, steady. Only my respect. Her breath caught. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw not only the grief in him, but the steadiness beneath it. A man shaped by loss, yes, but also by endurance. And in that moment, he saw her not as something broken, but as someone whole. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was different, fragile, human, honest. Eleanor lowered her eyes, her lips trembling. Thank you. Gideon nodded once. Then without another word, he stepped back into the hall, leaving her with the crackle of the fire and a heart that beat too fast for the stillness of the night. Days passed, the storm unrelenting. Snow piled high against the windows, the world outside swallowed by white. Inside, however, small changes began to bloom. Clara hovered closer to Eleanor now, no longer just watching, but reaching. One afternoon, Eleanor found a new drawing tucked beneath her pillow. It showed 3 figures again this time, all holding hands beneath a bright sun. But in the corner, scrawled in shaky letters, were the words, "Mama, stay." The paper trembled in Eleanor's hands. She pressed it to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. That evening, when Gideon returned from the barn dusted with snow, she held it out to him. "She's asking," Eleanor said softly. Gideon looked at the drawing, his face unreadable. But his hand lingered on the edge of the paper longer than necessary. "She hasn't spoken in 3 years," he said finally, "until the night you walked through the door, and she asked if I was going to leave." Eleanor's voice cracked. "She's afraid, Gideon, more than you know." His jaw tightened. "She has reason." Eleanor waited, but he said no more. Instead, he turned to stoke the fire, his shoulders rigid, his silence louder than any confession. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She rose and wandered the house in quiet, her fingers brushing over the piano keys, though she did not lift the lid. She paused at the mantel where Eliza's portrait stood, watching the delicate face of the woman who had once held this house together. "Do you want to know what happened to her?" Gideon's voice came suddenly from behind. Eleanor turned sharply. He stood in the shadows, arms crossed, his face set hard. "She disappeared." He said his words flat but thick with something heavier. "There was blood on the floor. On my shirt. And I was too drunk to remember any of it." The fire hissed in the silence that followed. Eleanor's breath caught. "You think you hurt her?" she whispered, his jaw clenched. "I don't know." He turned away, bracing his hands on the mantel. "The sheriff? My cousin said she ran off. Others weren't so sure. I've prayed for dreams, memories, anything, but there's nothing, just the hangover, and that damn blood." Eleanor's chest tightened. She saw the torment carved into his face, the weight of 3 years spent doubting himself. "You've carried this alone," she said softly. Gideon's voice broke just once. "Would you have stayed if I'd told you the first night Eleanor had no answer?" The truth was too complicated, her heart too tangled already. She lowered her eyes, unable to speak. The storm deepened. Snow pressed heavy against the walls, but inside a different kind of storm was building. Clara began drawing darker things, shadows, figures looming blood on the ground. Each one tightened a knot in Eleanor's chest. One afternoon, Clara slipped a paper into her lap and darted away. Eleanor unfolded it slowly. This one was jagged, frantic, a tall figure dragging a woman, a smaller figure lying on the ground. Above in shaky letters, "Pa is sleep." Her stomach turned. She carried the drawing to Gideon that night. He studied it without speaking, his face hollow. Finally, he said, "I told you, she has reason to be afraid." But in Eleanor's heart, a new suspicion had taken root. Clara's silence wasn't just grief. It was memory. And if the child remembered, then somewhere in the dark of that night 3 years ago, the truth was still waiting. The wind howled across the plains like a wounded beast, battering the windows until they rattled in their frames. Inside the Hale ranch house, the fire burned low, its glow struggling against the shadows that crept across the walls. Eleanor sat by the hearth. Clara curled in her lap, the child's small fingers tangled in the fringe of her shawl. She stroked the girl's hair, her own mind racing with the drawing she had seen only hours earlier. A shadow dragging a woman. Blood, and those chilling words, "Pa is sleep." Gideon sat at the table across the room, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The rasp of stone against steel filled the silence like a second heartbeat. He didn't look at Eleanor, but his jaw was clenched, his eyes distant. Finally, Eleanor spoke. She remembers something she said softly. Gideon's hand stilled on the blade. He set it down, leaning back in his chair. His face was unreadable, but his voice was tight. She was only 2. Too young to make sense of it. Children remember more than we think. Eleanor kissed the top of Clara's head. Her silence isn't just grief. It's fear. Gideon rose restless, pacing the edge of the room. His boots struck the floor with weight. Fear of me. Eleanor's chest ached. She wanted to deny it, to tell him Clara's drawings pointed elsewhere, but she didn't know the truth yet. And Gideon's torment was real. She needs answers, Eleanor whispered, and so do you. His eyes met hers for the briefest second, gray raw, filled with a torment that had no words before he turned and strode from the room. The door slammed against the storm outside, leaving Eleanor with Clara and the fire's dying glow. The following morning, Gideon left for the barn before dawn. Eleanor decided she couldn't wait for the truth to come to her. She wrapped herself in her heaviest cloak, pulled on boots stiff with cold, and set out across the frozen fields. The wind cut her skin raw, the snow crunching sharp beneath her steps. She followed the ridgeline until she saw a small cabin tucked into the trees, smoke curling thinly from the chimney. The townsfolk had spoken of it, of the widow who lived alone on the edge of the wilderness. Eleanor knocked. After a pause, the door creaked open and an old woman peered out. One eye clouded white with blindness, a long scar puckered down her neck. "Widow Harland?" Eleanor asked. The woman sniffed. "And who's asking? I'm staying at Gideon Hale's ranch," Eleanor replied cautiously. "I need to ask about his wife." Widow Harland's gaze sharpened. "You're his new woman." "I am no one's woman," Eleanor said firmly. "But I need the truth." The widow hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in then, if you've got the courage." The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Eleanor sat across from the widow, who rocked slowly in her chair, her gnarled hands folded tight. That night, Widow Harland began, "I heard a scream, just past midnight. But my husband was already in his grave, and I don't go chasing trouble in the dark." Her voice rasped like wind through broken branches. "What did you see?" Eleanor pressed. "Come morning, I stepped outside. Saw footprints in the snow leading down from the Hales' place. 2 sets. Eleanor leaned forward. "And only one came back." The words sank into Eleanor's chest like stones. Her breath hitched. "You told the sheriff." The widow's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff was Gideon's cousin. Told me to keep my mouth shut. Said the boy had enough pain without scandal. So I kept it. For 3 years. She looked away, her good eye clouding with something softer. But I always thought he deserved the truth, even if he was too broken to face it." Eleanor sat in silence, her hands trembling in her lap. The pieces began to shift inside her. Gideon's guilt, Clara's silence, blood that had never been explained. 2 sets of tracks, only one returning. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, rising to leave. The widow's voice followed her to the door. "Truth's a hard thing, girl. It'll cut you just as deep as lies if you're not ready for it." The walk back to the ranch felt longer. The storm had eased, but the wind still gnawed at her skin, and her thoughts churned heavier than the snowdrifts around her. When she reached the house, Gideon was inside, sitting at the table, his hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee, gone cold. "You went out?" he said without looking up. "Yes," Eleanor answered. She removed her cloak, her breath unsteady. "To Widow Harland." His head lifted sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Why?" "Because I needed answers." She crossed the room, standing firm even as his gaze hardened. She heard a scream that night. She saw 2 sets of tracks. Only one returned. Gideon's face went pale. For a long moment, he didn't breathe. "You think I killed her?" he said finally, his voice low, dangerous. "I think you've lived 3 years drowning in guilt for something you may not have done," Eleanor replied. Her voice shook, but her words held steady. His chair scraped back as he rose, towering over her. "And if I did?" His voice cracked like thunder. "If I was too drunk, too useless, and my own hands—" He stopped, chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. Eleanor reached out, daring to touch his arm. "Then you deserve the truth, Gideon. Not shadows, not silence. Truth." For a moment his body trembled beneath her touch. Then he turned away. his breath ragged. From the hallway, soft footsteps echoed. Clara stood there, clutching her doll, her wide eyes fixed on both of them. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She only stared at her father, then at Eleanor, as if begging them to finish what had been left broken too long. The fire had nearly burned out by the time Gideon lowered himself back into his chair. His face was pale, drawn tight with something Eleanor recognized as both fear and exhaustion. Clara hovered in the hallway, her doll pressed to her chest, her eyes darting between them as if she understood far more than a child ever should. Eleanor knelt down, slowly coaxing Clara closer. "Sweetheart," she whispered. "It's all right. Come here." Clara inched forward. When she was within arm's reach, she stopped and lifted the doll as if to protect it from the room. Eleanor opened her arms. The child hesitated, then pressed into them, small and shaking. Eleanor felt the tremor travel through her own bones. Gideon's chair scraped softly across the floor. He didn't rise. He seemed afraid to breathe too loudly, as though any sudden sound might scatter the fragile trust collecting in the room. "Clara," he said barely more than a breath. "We're listening." The girl didn't speak. She lifted her doll to Eleanor's ear as if the doll might whisper what she could not. Then she wriggled free and scurried to the table. A nub of charcoal lay by Gideon's ledger. She seized it in her fist and bent over the page, drawing in quick, desperate strokes. Eleanor stood and crossed to her. Gideon stayed where he was, knuckles pale around his mug. The charcoal rasped. Lines appeared crooked and urgent, a door, a dark rectangle for night, a tall shape with a slash for an arm, and a smaller shape beside it, stick legs splayed. Beside the door, the child dragged the charcoal in short stabbing motions until a jagged shape emerged, a knife. Clara paused, lifted her gaze to Eleanor as if asking permission, then added marks along the knife's handle, tiny diagonal stripes, a crosshatch pattern. She stared at the pattern for a long moment, then circled it hard as if begging Eleanor not to miss the detail. Eleanor swallowed. "A knife with marks on the handle," she murmured. Clara nodded. Hair tumbling into her face, she pushed it away with the back of her hand and drew again a hand with a square on one finger. A ring. Then under the smaller stick figure, she scratched the word with painful concentration. "Pa." After it, the same word she had written before, the one that felt like a stone falling into a well sleep. Gideon's breath shattered in his chest. He steadied himself on the table. I was passed out." Clara's hand hovered over the drawing, then moved to the tall figure. She added a hat broad-brimmed, the crown tilted. She hesitated, then drew something on the hat band, a gap like a missing ribbon. She circled that, too. Eleanor looked from the page to Gideon. "Did Eliza own a knife?" she asked gently. One with a patterned handle. Her kitchen knife had a smooth hickory grip. Gideon's voice sounded like wind through wire. "No crosshatch." "What about a ring?" "Eliza had a plain band, same as mine." He lifted his left hand. The ring winked in the firelight. No square stone. Eleanor and Gideon both turned to Clara. The girl's chest rose and fell fast. She glanced at Gideon, fear flickering, then made a choice. She drew a second set of lines leading from the door footprints like beads in the snow. 2 paths. One path returned. The other stopped at the page's edge, unfinished. Eleanor crouched so her eyes were level with Clara's. "You saw him," she said softly. "You saw a man with a knife, with a ring, with a hat missing its ribbon. And your father," she reached out, palm open toward Gideon. "Your father was sleeping." Clara's eyes filled. She nodded once hard enough that the motion shook her whole body. Gideon pressed his forearm to his mouth. Eleanor watched his shoulders tense, then shudder. He had carried a weight for 3 winters, a coffin built from doubt, and a 5-year-old's charcoal marks were prying the lid open. "I scrubbed that floor." Gideon's voice returned as if from a long way off. "For hours, for days. There's still stain beneath the boards by the back door." He swallowed. "I left the plank loose. Couldn't make myself nail it down." "Show me," Eleanor said. He moved like a man in a dream, crossing to the back door with a carpenter's certainty. He knelt, pried up a warped board with a pocket knife, and folded it back on its nails. Beneath a smear ran dark along the joist, a shadow that time hadn't erased. Around it, faint grooves scored the wood parallel scratches, as if something had been dragged. Or someone. Eleanor's chest went tight. She touched the grooves with 2 fingers, feeling the story that lived there. Panic struggle, a body pulled toward cold. Here, Gideon said quietly. And there. He pointed to the threshold where an old splintered scar marked the jam. Eliza kept the latch tied when the wind blew. The tie snapped that night. I never replaced it. Clara had crept to the doorway, peering over the plank. She set her doll down, little arms splayed on the wood, as if the doll too were listening. Then she did something she hadn't done since Eleanor arrived. She reached for Gideon's sleeve and tugged. He looked down, face raw, as Clara guided his hand to the gouges. She pressed his thick fingers into the scars in the wood, like a priest pressing a believer's palm to a reliquary. Gideon closed his eyes. His hand trembled under hers. Eleanor rose, knees cold, from the floor. Gideon, she said. 2 sets of tracks, a knife that wasn't hers, a ring she didn't own. You didn't do this. He shook his head. I drank. I was blind with it. You didn't do this, she repeated quieter. But someone did. He lifted his gaze. For the first time, his eyes cleared not with certainty, but with the start of it, the way dawn clears a window frosted thin. Then, who Eleanor looked at Clara's drawing again. The cross-hatched handle, the square ring, the hat with the missing band. She tucked those clues into her heart as if they were the last coal in a stove. We'll find him. Gideon let out a breath that scraped his throat on the way out. He replaced the plank carefully as if gentleness could make amends to the wood, then stood. There's one more thing. He went to the pantry, reached behind a sack of flour, and brought out a folded shirt once white, now a ghost of it. Across the front, faint but stubborn, a brown swell spread like a handprint over the ribs. Eleanor touched the cloth. It was stiff where the stain had dried years ago. You kept it. I tried to burn it. He stared at the hearth with something like shame. Couldn't. It felt like burning a confession. Eleanor folded the shirt carefully and put it back in his hands. It isn't a confession, she said. It's evidence. Of a night you survived, and a truth that survived you. Clara climbed onto a chair and banged the charcoal down on a clean scrap of paper. Eleanor and Gideon watched as she drew something new, a rectangle long as a forearm, maybe a belt. Along its length, she scratched little circles like conchos and a big square buckle at the end. Beside the buckle, she scrawled a small boxy shape, a stone. A belt with a square-buckled ring, Eleanor asked, uncertain. Claire shook her head, frustrated, then pinched her own finger where a ring would sit and held it up proudly. She tapped the square she'd drawn by the buckle. No, not by it. On it. A ring set into the buckle face like a showy ornament. She jabbed the square with the charcoal until the paper nearly tore. Showy Gideon murmured, like a man who needs to be seen. Eleanor caught the flicker in his eyes. Do you know anyone who wore something like that? Gideon's gaze slid away, scanning memories like fence lines in a storm. Hands came and went, winter crews, drovers in spring. I didn't pay attention the way Eliza did. His mouth twisted. She always noticed the small things. Eleanor glanced at the portrait above the mantel, the woman's unsmiling mouth, her pinned hair. She noticed enough to tie the latch when it howled. Snow hissed against the windows. The house listened. A ripple of heat ran up the chimney and was gone. We can ask in town, Eleanor said. Not now, the roads are closed, but when the weather breaks. The general store, the saloon, the blacksmith. Someone will remember a belt buckle with a square stone in it. Men wear the same bravado for years. Gideon nodded once, a soldier receiving orders. But his gaze had gone to Clara. Peanut, he said softly, calling her what Eliza once had. Thank you. Clara froze as if the word belonged to a room she had locked and left. Then slowly she nodded and slid from the chair. She picked up her doll and held it to Gideon like an offering. He took it awkward and reverent and pressed his lips to its yarn hair. Later, as night settled like black glass over the prairie, they ate a thin stew and sat close to the fire. Inside the quiet, Eleanor asked the question she had avoided. What do you remember from that night Gideon turned the bowl in his hands? The steam fogged and vanished. We argued. His voice was careful, as if stepping across a creek on winter stones. I don't remember why. Something small. It always is. He stared into the fire. She took Clara upstairs. I drank. The wind kept hitting the door. I went to bar it, and after that, nothing. I woke with grit in my mouth and blood like rust on my shirt. Any smell? Eleanor asked, surprising herself with the bluntness. Tobacco whiskey that wasn't yours. He frowned. I drank cheap rye, but I remember something sweeter, like mint. Mint chew. Some men keep mint leaves with their plug. It covers the rot. Eleanor's mind seized on it, the hat with a gap in its ribbon, the showy square set into a belt buckle, a knife with a cross-hatched grip, and the faint sweetness of mint. A man who wanted to be noticed, a man who didn't think a 2-year-old could notice him. Clara had drifted to sleep against Eleanor's shoulder by the time the fire burned down to red coals. Gideon carried her to bed, his big hands gentle on the small blanket-wrapped body, and returned with the quiet of a man who hears his own footsteps differently than before. At the door, Eleanor caught his sleeve. He stopped. The lamplight carved his features in amber and shadow. "You are not your worst night," she said. "You are the man who just pressed his fingers to scars in the floor and let truth hurt you so it could heal her." He swallowed. The muscle in his jaw jumped. "And you are the woman who walked into my storm and refused to freeze." Their hands hovered near not touching. The space between them felt like a wick waiting for a match. Then Gideon stepped back, not with rejection, but restraint, and nodded toward the hall. "Sleep," he said. "We ride for town at first thaw." Eleanor watched him cross to the hearth and settle in the chair like a sentry. She blew out the lamp and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the quiet, the long, steady breaths of a house choosing to live again. In her room, she unfolded Clara's newest drawing and laid it beside the others, the knife, the cross-hatched grip, the hat with the missing ribbon, the belt buckle with its square stone. She traced each with a fingertip, sealing them into memory. Beyond the wall, wind combed the drifts with a sound like distant surf. Eleanor lay down, pulled the quilt to her chin, and whispered into the dark where no one could hear, not even herself. "Hold. Hold the clues. Hold the child. Hold the man who has forgotten how." Morning would come, the storm would lift, tracks would be made again. And somewhere under the hard, pale sky of this country, a man with a flashy buckle and a mint-sweet mouth would feel the ground shift beneath his boots, as if the winter itself had turned to watch him. The storm finally began to ease, not with a sudden break, but with small mercies. A patch of pale sky above the ridge, a trickle of water slipping beneath the ice at the creek. The roads were still buried, but the silence that had pressed against the house for days seemed to lift just enough to let breath pass easier. Eleanor felt it the moment she stepped outside. The cold still cut her skin, but the weight of it was not suffocating anymore. She stood at the fence, watching Gideon work in the yard. He moved with a practiced economy, pitching hay to the horses, shoveling out drifts by the barn door. Each motion was deliberate, as if keeping busy could push back the shadows that haunted him. Clara clung to the fence rail, eyes bright against her pale face, her little fingers wrapped tight around the wood. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her presence said enough. Eleanor's thoughts were not in the yard, though. They were on the widow's words, on the drawings, on the details etched into her memory. The knife with cross-hatched grip, the belt buckle with its showy square stone, the scent of mint, and the 2 sets of tracks in the snow. Only one returned. That night, when Clara was asleep and the house had settled into its long winter creek, Eleanor sat across from Gideon at the fire. The glow painted his face in copper shadows, deepening the hollows around his eyes. "We can't carry this silence any longer," she said softly. Gideon's gaze flicked up. He didn't answer. "Your cousin silenced the widow," Eleanor pressed. "But he can't silence the truth. There's someone in this valley who wore that buckle, who carried that knife. We'll find him." Gideon leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. "You think the town will speak? You think they'll look me in the eye and tell me anything after 3 years of whispers?" "You've lived those whispers," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "You've let them bury you alive." "But Clara's drawings, they're not whispers. They're testimony." His jaw tightened. For a long moment, only the crackle of the fire filled the room. Finally, he said, When the thaw comes, we'll ride in. Ask questions. I'll take you to the Harlan's cabin first so you can see I didn't imagine her story. You don't need to convince me, Gideon." His eyes lifted sharply to hers. For a moment they burned with something raw, need, fear, perhaps even gratitude, but then the wall came back down. He nodded, once clipped as if any more would break him. The thaw did not come quickly. Days turned into a week, and the snow gave up its hold inch by inch. Eleanor filled the time with Clara sewing small stitches together, teaching her how to mend a handkerchief, reading verses from the old Bible. Clara's silence was no longer empty. It was filled with listening, with watching, with the slow, fragile act of trusting. One morning, Eleanor awoke to find Clara curled against her side, the child's small hand gripping her sleeve even in sleep. It pierced her in a place she had thought long dead. She remembered the letter, the doctor's words, the likelihood of childbearing is minimal to none. And yet here was a child breathing softly against her arm, claiming her in silence. She pressed a kiss to Clara's hair. "I'll stay," she whispered, "as long as you need me." When at last the snow melted enough to free the road, Gideon harnessed the wagon. The sky was still gray, the ground muddy with thaw, but the way to town was open. Clara rode between them, bundled in a thick shawl, her wide eyes taking in every tree and drift as though she expected the land itself to hold the answers. The ride was long, the horses plodding, the wheels sinking deep in the slush. Neither Gideon nor Eleanor spoke much. The air between them was weighted with what they were about to unearth. Fort Bridger was no more than a cluster of wooden buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of a hammer ringing from the blacksmith's forge. People turned as the wagon pulled in. Some nodded at Gideon, others looked away quickly, their whispers floating like snow in the air. Eleanor noticed. Gideon noticed too. His shoulder squared, his hand tightening on the reins, but he said nothing. They stopped at the mercantile. Eleanor climbed down first, helping Clara after her. Gideon lingered by the wagon, his eyes sweeping the street. Inside, the air smelled of flour and coffee, pine boards creaking underfoot. Behind the counter stood Mr. Parsons, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up startled when Gideon entered, then cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale." His voice was polite but stiff. "It's been a while." Gideon gave a curt nod. "We're looking for information about a man who worked these parts years back." Parsons frowned, but Eleanor stepped forward before he could retreat into evasions. Her voice was calm, steady, but sharp enough to cut through the dust. "A man with a belt buckle," she said. "Square stone set in it. Flashy. The kind of thing folks don't forget." Parsons blinked. His mouth open-closed. Then he adjusted his spectacles, glancing at Gideon as if weighing whether to answer. "I recall a hand like that," he admitted slowly. "Came through 3 winters ago. Worked the saloon, sometimes helped at the livery. Name of Jonas Danner. Mean streak. Wore a buckle just like you described, square turquoise set in silver. Thought it made him look grand." Eleanor's heart kicked. Gideon's face turned to stone. "Where is he now?" Gideon asked. Parsons shifted uneasily. "Last I heard, he drifted south toward the canyons. But men like him, they come back around when the weather suits." Clara tugged at Eleanor's skirt. When Eleanor glanced down, the girl's eyes were wide, her hand trembling as she clutched her doll. She mouthed a single word without sound. "Him." Eleanor knelt, cupping her cheek. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "do you know this name, Danner?" Clara didn't speak, but she nodded once hard. When they left the mercantile, Gideon's steps were heavy, his breath white in the cold. He looked out over the muddy street, his jaw clenched so tight Eleanor thought it might crack. "That's the man," he said. Not a question, a statement. He's the one who took Eliza. Eleanor placed her hand lightly on his arm. "Then we'll find him. For her. For Clara." Gideon's gaze shifted to his daughter, who clung to Eleanor's skirts, eyes still wide with remembered fear. His chest rose and fell, the storm inside him, as fierce as any that had raged across the plains. "Not just for them," he said, voice rough. "For me, to put an end to 3 years of ghosts." The road home from Fort Bridger was longer than the road in. The wagon wheels cut through thawing mud, and the wind carried whispers of things, unearthed things that would not go back into silence. Eleanor sat with Clara nestled against her side, the child's head resting just under her arm, her eyes fixed on the horizon with a faraway stare. Gideon drove in silence, his shoulders rigid, his hands clenched around the reins until his knuckles showed white. The name lingered in the air between them. Jonas Danner. A man who wore a flashy buckle, a crosshatched knife handle, a hat with a missing ribbon. A man Clara remembered even though she hadn't had words to speak of him until now. Back at the ranch, Eleanor busied herself with supper, her hands moving through motions of chopping and stirring while her mind churned. Gideon sat at the table silent, sharpening his axe, though it was already sharp. Clara hovered close to Eleanor, unwilling to let her out of reach. When the stew was simmering, Eleanor set down the spoon and looked across at Gideon. His jaw was tight, his eyes lost in firelight. "You can't face this alone," she said. He looked up sharply, as though startled from a dream. "He killed Eliza. If he's still breathing, then yes, I'll face him alone." Eleanor shook her head. "You'll face him, but not alone. You have Clara now. You have me." For a heartbeat, Gideon's hard expression faltered. Something softer flickered through his eyes, but he smothered it with a shake of his head. "This land teaches one thing," he muttered. "A man settles his own debts." Eleanor crossed the room, her boots soft against the plank floor. She stopped just in front of him, close enough to feel the heat from the fire. "And what about the debts that aren't yours? You've carried the weight of guilt for 3 years. But that man, Jonas Danner, he's the one who left your daughter motherless. He's the one Clara still dreams about. This isn't just your burden, Gideon. It's hers too, and mine if you'll let it be." His eyes met hers, then gray storm meeting blue flame. For the first time since she arrived, he didn't look away. Clara perched on a stool near the hearth, lifted her doll, and pressed its head against her cheek. Then she whispered a sound so soft Eleanor almost missed it. "Stay." Gideon froze. Eleanor felt the breath catch in her own chest. Clara's lips moved again, trembling but clear. "Stay, Mama." The room went still. Gideon's sharpening stone slipped from his hand, thudding against the table. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She dropped to her knees in front of Clara, cupping the girl's face in both hands. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered, her own voice breaking. "I'll stay." Clara wrapped her arms around Eleanor's neck, pressing her face into her shoulder. For the first time in 3 years, the child had spoken more than a single word. When Eleanor lifted her gaze to Gideon, his face was pale, his eyes wet with something he couldn't mask. He looked at her, then at Clara, then back again, and nodded once as if some unspoken truth had just been sealed. The days that followed were uneasy. Spring pushed slowly through the snow, dripping from the eaves, softening the ground. But inside the ranch, tension coiled tight. Gideon worked longer hours in the barn, mending fences, preparing for calving season. Eleanor spent her days with Clara, teaching her to thread a needle to stir batter without spilling flour across the table, to read the smallest words in the Bible. But always beneath it all, the shadow of Jonas Danner lingered. One afternoon, Eleanor caught Gideon standing at the fence line, his rifle slung over his shoulder, staring out across the valley as though expecting the man to appear on the horizon. She walked out to him, the wind tugging at her shawl. "You can't haunt yourself into readiness," she said gently. His mouth twisted. "I don't intend to wait. When the snows are clear, I'll ride south, find him before he finds me." "And leave Clara again?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharp now. "Leave her wondering if you'll come back, Gideon." She just found her voice. "Don't let her lose it to silence again." He flinched. Her words struck true. He turned, meeting her eyes with a rawness that startled her. "Then what do I do?" Eleanor touched his arm steady. "You protect her. You keep the ranch strong. And when the time comes when he shows his face, we face him together." His gaze held hers for a long time. At last he nodded slowly. That night, as wind swept across the plains, Eleanor woke to a sound outside a creek, faint like a saddle shifting. She rose quietly, pulling her shawl close, and moved to the window. The yard lay silver under the moonlight, the barn a hulking shadow. For a moment nothing stirred. Then she saw it, the faint outline of tracks in the fresh snow near the fence. Boot prints. Too large to be Gideon's, too heavy for a traveler merely passing through. Her stomach tightened. The next morning she told Gideon. His expression hardened, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his hip. "He's close," Gideon said. His voice was low, final. "Danner." Clara at the table looked up at the name. Her small hand clutched Eleanor's sleeve. Eleanor pulled the child close, her heart hammering. "Then we'll be ready," she whispered. But deep inside, she knew the storm outside had passed, but another was already forming, not of snow and wind, but of blood and reckoning. The morning sun crept thinly across the frost-coated windows, pale and cold. It lit the yard where Gideon's boots had carved restless patterns, as if he had been pacing the earth to exhaustion. Eleanor had not slept either. Clara had stirred in and out of dreams, clutching Eleanor's sleeve, as though even sleep could not make her let go. By afternoon, the house settled into silence. Gideon came in from the barn, a rim of cold clinging to him. He was out there, he said. His voice was flat, but his eyes gave him away. Eleanor nodded. She had seen the tracks herself, heavy, slanted, a man who wanted to be noticed. "We can't meet this foolishly," she told him. "You think I confuse foolishness with courage?" His mouth almost curved. "I think you confuse punishment with penance," she replied softly. "You've been doing it for 3 years." He didn't answer, but the quiet admitted she was right. That evening, the smell of stew filled the house. Clara sat at the table scribbling sons and horses, adding a woman holding a child in every picture now. The bundle never had a name, but it didn't need one. It was always safe in her drawings. When she nodded with sleep, Gideon carried her upstairs. Eleanor listened to his careful steps, the click of the latch closing. When he came back, he stood by the fire, his hands open to the heat, his face caught in its light. "I wear a ring. I don't know how to take off," he said. Eleanor lifted her gaze. "She taught me this place," Gideon continued. "How to hold Clara, how to cook, how to fix a knot. The wind couldn't pull loose. Eliza made the house make sense. Some days I can't hear her voice at all. Other days it's all I hear. I keep this ring for both fears." His words settled into Eleanor like stones. She thought of her own scars, her own letter folded into silence. She didn't rush to answer. "Deserving is a poor measure for love," she said at last. "It isn't a ledger. It's a vow kept when the roof leaks and the wind screams." He gave something like a laugh, though grief tangled in it. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't. It's stubbornness dressed as gentleness." For a long moment, he looked at her as if the world might give way. Then instead of speaking, he lifted the piano lid. The first notes cracked dusty with silence. Eleanor joined him with a hymn she half remembered, and though the keys faltered, their laughter at the end was real. When he let the lid fall, his shoulder brushed hers. "It's easier to breathe when you're here," he said quietly. The words were not a confession, only truth. Night lowered heavy. Gideon checked the doors. They walked the house together, testing latches, setting a cord with pans to rattle if someone crossed the hall. Each corner became a promise: we will not be taken unawares. When they were done, the silence was not fear, it was readiness. Eleanor brushed crumbs from the table into her palm, watching him. "If he comes, it will be on a moonless night." "Tomorrow," Gideon said. "Clouds are thickening." She nodded. "Then tonight we stand watch." They shared the long hours' faces lit by the small lamp. Gideon showed her where shadows could hide a rifle, where a careless intruder would expose his side. She listened, memorizing. At one point, he reached across and laid his hand over hers. Not claiming. Just there. A presence like a log set to keep the fire alive until morning. "You told me once you weren't born to be a mother," he murmured. "I wasn't," she said. "You are one," he answered simply. Her throat caught. She turned away before her tears showed. Clara cried out upstairs. Eleanor rushed to her, whispered her back into sleep, then returned to find Gideon waiting on the stair, his elbows on his knees like a man unwilling to enter an empty house. She told him she dreamed of the buckle, not the man, just the shine. He nodded. Sometimes the mind clings to what it thinks it can survive. Later, when the clock neared midnight, Gideon lifted Eliza's portrait down from the mantel. He dusted the frame, wiped the glass, and then pinned one of Clara's drawings beside it. 3 stick figures beneath a bright sun. The portrait and the child's scrawl shared the mantel without argument. The house seemed to breathe differently, as though memory and present had finally agreed to stand side by side. Eleanor looked at Gideon. "You're learning. I have a teacher," he said. The lamp guttered. A faint trace of mint drifted in with the draft. Eleanor and Gideon both turned to the door. His hand closed around the rifle stock. "Not tonight," he said, but his eyes never left the dark. They sat until dawn together, waiting. Not for fear, But to keep what the night had given them, the thaw deepened. Patches of brown earth broke through the white crust of snow, and the creeks gurgled again under their skins of ice. Life stirred across the valley, but inside the Hale Ranch, the unease only grew sharper. Every knock of a loose shutter, every creak of a board in the wind seemed louder, heavier, as if the house itself knew a reckoning was walking toward it. Eleanor kept busy cooking, sewing, mending Clara's dresses, yet her eyes always drifted to the windows. Clara had begun to cling to her skirts again, her newfound words lost back into silence. When Eleanor pressed her gently, the girl only shook her head and buried her face deeper into her shawl. But at night, Eleanor woke to find Clara sitting upright in bed, staring at the window as though she feared what might be outside. Gideon slept little. Often Eleanor found him outside at dawn, boots soaked, rifle across his knees, staring toward the horizon. His face looked harder each morning, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by worry and vigilance. He was waiting for something he could not stop. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the rider came. Eleanor spotted him first, a shadow moving slow along the ridge. She was carrying a bucket from the pump when the figure paused against the skyline. Her breath hitched water sloshing down her skirt. Gideon stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands. He followed her gaze and stilled. The man on the ridge turned his horse down the slope, riding steady, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Dust rose with each hoof step. His coat was worn, his hat pulled low, its crown missing the ribbon. Eleanor's heart clenched. Clara, who had wandered to the yard, froze, her little body stiff as a board. Then, without a sound, she bolted back into the house. Eleanor reached for her, but Clara had already vanished inside. When she turned back, the rider was nearly at the gate. He swung down from his horse boots, sinking into the thawing mud, and removed his hat. His face was weathered jaw, set eyes like rusted nails. "Name's Jonas Danner," he said, his voice carrying calm menace. "Used to work this place. Heard Gideon Hale still lived here." Gideon stood, tall, hands relaxed at his sides, though Eleanor saw the tension coiled in every muscle. "I live here," he said flatly. Danner nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Good to see it hasn't all gone to waste." He glanced past Gideon to the house, to the faint flutter of curtain at the window where Clara peeked out. His eyes narrowed and a small, humorless smile tugged at his mouth. Eleanor's blood went cold. Clara's terror was confirmation enough. Inside, Eleanor found Clara hiding beneath the bed in the guest room. The girl was trembling, clutching her doll with such force the cloth nearly tore. Eleanor knelt, heart pounding. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "what is it? Tell me." Clara shook her head, eyes wide with terror. Then, with a desperate motion, she grabbed a piece of charcoal from Eleanor's sewing basket and began to scrawl across the wooden floorboards. The lines were frantic, jagged, but unmistakable. A tall man, a woman pulled by the arm, blood spilling like black rain. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Clara's hand moved faster, drawing the same buckle, the same cross-hatched knife. Her breaths came ragged, almost sobbing without sound. "Oh, God," Eleanor breathed. She turned for the rifle mounted above the fireplace, but before her hands reached it, the door slammed open. Danner stood there, his hat-low eyes fixed on her with eerie calm. "She remembers, doesn't she?" he said softly. Eleanor's heart seized. She stepped in front of Clara, forcing steadiness into her voice. "You killed her," she said. Danner's smile widened, but it never touched his eyes. "She wasn't supposed to be there. Neither was the kid. But Gideon, he was too deep in the bottle to notice. Easy work." He stepped forward, pulling a knife from beneath his coat. Its handle gleamed with the same crosshatch Clara had drawn. "Can't have anyone talking now." Eleanor's hand darted for the rifle. Danner was faster. He swiped it aside, sending it clattering across the floor. She turned to shield Clara, but his hand shot out, gripping her arm like iron. He shoved her back against the wall, the knife flashing as it rose. Clara screamed, a sound raw and piercing, shattering 3 years of silence. "No," Eleanor cried, twisting. She threw herself between the knife and the child. The blade cut deep across her side. Fire tore through her body as she collapsed to the floor, blood spreading dark across her bodice. "Eleanor," Gideon's voice thundered from the doorway. The crack of a rifle split the air. Danner staggered back, clutching his side. His knife clattered to the boards. Gideon stormed forward, face carved in fury, rifle still smoking. He kicked the blade away, his breath coming like a storm. Eleanor gasped, pressing her hand to the wound, crimson welling between her fingers. Clara dropped beside her, sobbing uncontrollably. "Stay with me," Gideon rasped, kneeling, his rough hands trying to staunch the flow. "Don't you dare leave." Clara clung to Eleanor's arm, her small body shaking. And then through the tears came the word that broke everything. "Mama!" she screamed. "Mama, don't go!" Eleanor's heart wrenched. Gideon froze his eyes, flooding at the sound. Clara pressed her face against Eleanor's chest, refusing to let go. Neighbors drawn by the gunshot began to arrive, their shouts filling the yard. One, a former deputy, recognized Danner immediately. Hands restrained him. Voices called for the sheriff. But none of it mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the child's cry, the blood soaking through Eleanor's dress, and the way Gideon whispered her name like a prayer against the storm that had finally come inside his walls. The house became a fevered blur of voices, boots pounding doors thrown wide. The neighbors dragged Jonas Danner away, his curses spilling into the night air until distance swallowed them. But inside the chaos centered on one place, Eleanor bleeding on the floorboards, Clara weeping against her, Gideon pressing rough hands against the wound, as if sheer will could stop the tide. "Stay with me," Gideon begged, his voice hoarse, breaking. "Eleanor, look at me. You can't go now." Her breath came ragged, shallow, every inhalation a knife in her ribs. The room tilted around her shadows, bending and twisting, but she forced her gaze upward into Gideon's storm-gray eyes. "I promised her," she whispered, lips pale. "I promised I wouldn't leave." Clara clung tighter, her face streaked with tears. "Mama," she sobbed. The word fell from her lips like it had been waiting years to be spoken. Eleanor brushed weak fingers against the girl's cheek, leaving a crimson smear. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not leaving you." The neighbors bustled, voices colliding. "Fetch the doctor. Heat more water. Hold the wound." But Gideon stayed locked to her knees in the blood-soaked boards, refusing to let anyone else touch her. He pressed his palm over the wound, his jaw-clenched, eyes raw. "She saved that child." One man muttered. "She saved them both," another whispered. Gideon's head snapped up. His voice thundered through the house. "Then help me keep her alive." The men fell silent, ashamed, then rushed to obey. The hours that followed blurred into firelight and fever. The doctor arrived near dawn, his bag rattling with glass vials. He worked quickly, stitching, cleaning, pressing cloths to staunch the bleeding. Gideon hovered close, every muscle taut, every breath ragged. Clara sat curled beside Eleanor on the bed, refusing to leave her small hands holding Eleanor's limp one. "She's strong," the doctor muttered as he worked. "Stubborn, too, I'd wager." "She's stronger than any of us," Gideon said, his voice breaking. When at last the doctor leaned back, sweat glistening on his brow, he said, "She may yet live, but the fever will decide." Gideon's heart lurched. He sank to the floor beside the bed, elbows on his knees, forehead against his fists. Eleanor stirred in her sleep, whispering something half-formed. Gideon leaned close. Her lips brushed his ear. "Don't let me go." "You're not going anywhere," he whispered fiercely. "Do you hear me? You're staying with me, with her." The fever came like a tide, pulling Eleanor under, then tossing her back into the shallows, only to drag her down again. Gideon stayed by her side through every hour, dampening cloths, whispering her name, begging God for mercy. Clara kept vigil too, curling against her, sometimes falling asleep, only to wake crying, her little hand never letting go of Eleanor's sleeve. When the fever broke briefly, Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. She saw Gideon slumped in the chair, his head bowed, exhaustion carving hollows in his face. Clara stirred at her side, whispering, "Mama." Eleanor turned her head weakly, managing a faint smile. "I'm here, little one." Clara pressed her cheek to her arm, sighing with relief. Gideon jerked awake at the sound of her voice. He leaned forward, taking her hand in both of his eyes wet. "I never should have let you get hurt," he said hoarsely. Eleanor shook her head faintly. "Worth it. For her." Clara looked between them, her gaze far older than her years. She reached for the damp cloth, mimicking what she had seen Gideon do, and gently laid it across Eleanor's forehead. Then she whispered, clear and certain, "She's my mama now." Gideon's chest broke. He bowed his head over Eleanor's hand, pressing it to his lips. "You saved us both," he whispered. The days crawled by. Eleanor lingered between worlds, sometimes clear, sometimes lost in fever's grasp. Gideon hardly left her side. He shaved days-old stubble with shaking hands, kept the fire stoked, and read aloud from Clara's Bible, in a voice that cracked on the simplest words. Neighbors came and went, bringing food, asking after her condition, muttering that Danner was locked in the jailhouse awaiting trial. None of it mattered to Gideon. His world was no longer the valley or the ranch, or even the storm that had threatened to tear them apart. His world was narrowed to the bed where Eleanor lay and the child who called her Mama. Sometimes when Eleanor stirred, Gideon caught her hand and whispered promises he had never dared voice aloud. "If you stay, I'll spend the rest of my life proving you were meant to walk into this house. Not by accident, not by mistake, by grace." She smiled faintly once her lips dry, her eyes shimmering. "Grace," she whispered. "Yes." Spring crept quietly into the valley. Snow melted from the eaves. Birds returned to the bare trees. Life pressed on uncaring of men's wounds. But inside the house, healing was slower. Eleanor's body mended by inches. She could sit up after weeks, though pain laced every movement. She walked the room with Clara clinging to her hand. Each day, Gideon hovered, guiding her steps without touching her unless she faltered. His eyes stayed on her as if afraid she would vanish like smoke if he looked away too long. "You're stronger than you know," he told her. "I've had reason to be," she replied, glancing at Clara. The child smiled for the first time without fear, a crooked, uncertain grin that warmed the house more than any fire could. But when Eleanor sat alone by the window one morning, quilt wrapped around her shoulders, she wrote with a trembling hand, "Dear Gideon, you have given me a warmth I thought I would never feel again. But I am not whole. I cannot give you children. You and Clara deserve more than what I can offer. Please know that I love you both, but love is not always enough." She folded the letter carefully and placed it beneath Eliza's portrait on the mantel. Then she turned back toward the stairs, unaware that Clara, tiptoeing down from her nap, had already seen it. Clara's eyes moved quickly over the page, catching one sentence clear as a wound. "I cannot be her mother." Her chest tightened. She didn't cry. Instead, she pulled on her boots, wrapped herself in her scarf, and slipped quietly out into the cold. By the time Eleanor noticed the front door ajar, the wind had already begun to rise again. The wind clawed across the valley, scattering snowflakes that had lingered from the thaw, biting into the skin like sharp salt. Eleanor stood frozen at the open doorway, her breath caught in her throat. The letter still lay beneath Eliza's portrait, its words burning into her mind. And Clara. Sweet, fragile, Clara was gone. Her scream tore through the house. "Clara." She bolted outside, skirts whipping around her legs, eyes straining against the white haze. But there were no small footprints in the yard, only the storm already sweeping the tracks away. Gideon came running from the barn, his hands raw from work, his face paling at the sight of Eleanor's terror. "What happened?" She read the letter. Eleanor gasped. "She thinks I'm leaving. Gideon, she's gone. She thinks I don't want her." For a heartbeat, his face went hollow with disbelief. Then he threw the saddle onto the mare with a violence born of desperation. He yanked the cinch tight, swung up, and reached a hand down to Eleanor. "Come on, we'll find her." She clambered behind him, clutching his waist as he spurred the horse into the rising storm. The valley blurred in sheets of white and shadow. The mare pounded through slush and ice breath, steaming nostrils flaring. Gideon shouted Clara's name until his throat turned raw. Eleanor clung to him, scanning the riverbed, the tree line, every hollow where a child might hide. The wind swallowed their voices. Branches creaked overhead like old bones. Every minute that passed tightened Eleanor's chest until she thought her ribs might crack. Clara had been through so much if the cold took her now, if fear carried her beyond reach. "No," Eleanor whispered, pressing her face into Gideon's back. "We'll find her. We must." The mare stumbled through a drift. Gideon pulled her steady, then pointed. There. Between the trees, a faint splash of blue, a child's shawl. He slid off before the horse stopped moving. Eleanor nearly fell as she scrambled down after him. They stumbled through the drifts, hearts hammering. Beneath a gnarled pine lay Clara, curled tight arms wrapped around her doll cheeks, pale lips blue. Her eyes fluttered open as they knelt beside her. Baby Eleanor choked out, gathering the child into her arms. "Oh, what have you done?" Clara's lips trembled. Her voice was faint, broken. "You don't want me?" Eleanor's tears spilled hot onto the girl's icy skin. She pressed her forehead to Clara's. "No, no, sweetheart. I was never leaving you. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. I will never leave you." Gideon wrapped his coat around them both, his big hands trembling. His voice cracked as he spoke, fierce and certain. "Don't you ever run from us again. Do you hear me? You're our little girl. Nothing changes that." Clara's arms reached up weakly, locking around Eleanor's neck. "I want you to be my mama forever," she whispered. Eleanor sobbed, holding her tight. "Then I will be. Forever, if you'll have me." Gideon's hand found Eleanor's, their fingers intertwining over Clara's small back. He squeezed once, sealing a vow none of them would ever break. They carried Clara back on the mare, shielding her from the wind with their bodies. The ride home was long, but when they reached the ranch, neighbors had gathered, drawn by the search. Warm blankets and hot broth met them at the door. The house, once haunted by silence, rang with voices and prayer. Eleanor laid Clara in bed, tucking the quilt around her. The girl's eyelids drooped, but her lips curled faintly as she whispered one last time, "Mama." Eleanor smoothed her hair back, her own heart breaking with joy. "Rest, my darling. I'm here." Downstairs, Gideon stood at the mantel, staring at the letter still lying beneath Eliza's portrait. He picked it up, unfolded it, and read the words Eleanor had written in her weakness. His hand shook as he set it into the fire. The flames curled it into ash. When Eleanor came down, she froze at the sight. "I meant every word she whispered." "I know," Gideon said. His eyes were wet, his face raw. "But you're wrong. You say you can't give us a future, but you already have. You gave Clara her voice back. You gave me back my life." Eleanor's breath trembled. "But Gideon, I can't." He stepped forward, silencing her with his hand over hers. "Family isn't about what we can't give. It's about what we choose to give. And I choose you. Clara already has." For a long moment they stood in the firelight, the weight of years melting away. Outside, the storm was breaking. Inside, for the first time, the house felt like home. The storm broke by morning, leaving the world hushed in a blanket of new white. Sunlight struck the drifts until they gleamed like glass, and the air smelled sharp, cleansed. Inside the ranch house, warmth returned slowly, fragile as a newborn flame. Clara slept long and deep, her small hand still tangled in Eleanor's sleeve, refusing to release her even in dreams. Eleanor sat at the bedside, watching the child breathe. Every rise and fall of her chest was a gift. Every twitch of her lashes reminded Eleanor of how close she had come to losing her. When Clara stirred, her lips shaped the word "mama" again, even in sleep. It pierced Eleanor's heart like a hymn. Downstairs, Gideon tended the fire. His boots scraped the floor, his movements steady but subdued. When Eleanor finally descended, he looked up, his face rough with fatigue but softened in a way she had not seen before. "You stayed with her all night," he said. "I'll always stay," Eleanor whispered. He nodded once, as if the words had already been carved in stone. Life began again in small ways. The days lengthened, snow retreated from the fence lines, and the sound of melting filled the air. Gideon mended harnesses in the barn. Eleanor set seeds aside for the spring garden. Clara followed them both, her silence no longer emptiness, but comfort broken now and then by words so precious each one felt like a treasure. "Mama," "Papa," "Stay." But beneath it all, Eleanor carried a weight. At night when the house was quiet, she heard her own letter echoing in her mind. "I cannot give you children. You deserve more than I can offer." She had meant to protect Gideon and Clara from disappointment, but her words had nearly destroyed them. One evening after supper, she stood by the mantel. Eliza's portrait still hung there, the dust cleared Clara's childish drawing pinned beside it. The sight filled Eleanor with both gratitude and ache. She had stepped into a life that was never meant for her, and though Clara called her mama now, she feared it could never be enough. "Gideon," she said softly. He looked up from his chair, his gray eyes meeting hers. I need to tell you the truth again. I need to say it aloud this time. He set his mug down slowly. Then say it. She swallowed hard. I love you. I love Clara. But I'm not whole. I can't give you more children. I can't give you the family Eliza once could. The fire crackled. Gideon's expression didn't shift. He rose, walked toward her, and stopped just a breath away. You think I want children because I lost them? His voice was low, steady. Eleanor, I want this. You. Clara. What we have right here. Eliza gave me a life. She gave me Clara. And when she was gone, I thought the rest of my days were meant for silence. He reached out his rough fingers, brushing her cheek with gentleness she hadn't expected. But you walked into my storm. You gave Clara her voice back. You gave me breath when I thought I'd forgotten how. Don't tell me you aren't enough. You're more than I ever deserved. Her breath caught tears filling her eyes. But what if the past still owns you? He shook his head. The past buried me. You dug me out. The man who owned that buckle, the man who killed Eliza, he doesn't own this house. He doesn't own me, and he sure as hell doesn't own you. Eleanor's tears spilled freely then. She leaned into his touch, her heart breaking and healing all at once. That night, Clara crawled into their bed, her doll tucked beneath her arm. Gideon shifted to make room, Eleanor pulling the child close between them. Clara sighed contentedly, whispering in her sleep. Mama, Papa. Eleanor lay awake for a long time, listening to the rhythm of their breaths. She thought of the years she had spent wandering the war that had scarred her body and left her empty, the loneliness that had driven her to sign her name with the matrimonial agency. She thought of arriving at the wrong ranch, of Gideon's cold eyes, of Clara's trembling whisper, God finally sent you to us. And now, here they were. She pressed a kiss to Clara's hair, then reached across to find Gideon's hand. His fingers closed around hers, strong, steady, unyielding. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt whole. But the world outside their walls had not forgotten Jonas Danner. 1 week later, word came from town, Danner had slipped his shackles. He'd vanished into the wild country before he could face the judge. The sheriff rode out with deputies, but men like Danner didn't vanish by accident. They circled back. Gideon read the news in silence, his jaw like iron. Eleanor felt Clara's small hand slip into hers, trembling. The storm of snow had passed, but another storm was waiting on the horizon, and this time it would not be a mistake of fate that brought it to their door. The word of Danner's escape spread through the valley like fire over dry grass. Men muttered, and the mercantile women locked their doors earlier, and children were called in from play before dusk. But at the Hale Ranch, the news hit heavier than anywhere else. Gideon stood by the window that night, staring out across the open plain. His rifle leaned against the wall, already cleaned and loaded. Eleanor watched him from the hearth. Clara curled in her lap with her doll tucked beneath her chin. He'll come back, Gideon said, his voice low, certain. Eleanor stroked Clara's hair, her heart pounding. Then we'll be ready. Gideon turned his gray eyes sharp. You don't understand. A man like Danner doesn't leave unfinished things behind. He'll come for me, he'll come for you, and he'll come for her. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. Then let him come. He won't find us unprepared. For a moment, Gideon looked as if he might argue, but instead his face softened, the lines around his eyes easing. You don't scare easy, do you? Not anymore, Eleanor said. The days that followed were tense. Gideon worked the ranch with an edge in every motion, stacking wood higher, double-checking the barn doors, oiling the hinges of every rifle and revolver. Eleanor joined him, learning quickly, watching how he sighted down a barrel, how he held the weight steady. Clara followed at a distance, always near enough to touch Eleanor's skirt, when fear tightened her chest. At night, they took turns keeping watch. The sound of the wind across the fields became a warning, the creak of a shutter a threat. Still, the storm never came, until it did. It was just before sundown when Gideon spotted movement near the southern fence. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his breath sharp in the cold. Eleanor joined him, peering into the distance. At first it seemed like nothing, just a rider passing low against the horizon, but then the shape grew clearer. The wide-brimmed hat, the missing ribbon, The posture of a man who rode as though he owned every stretch of earth his horse touched. Danner Gideon muttered. Eleanor's stomach clenched. Clara, who had been playing quietly on the floor, looked up at the name. Her face went pale, her doll slipping from her hands. Go inside, Gideon told Eleanor. Bar the door. Keep her safe. Eleanor's hand shot out, gripping his arm. You'll face him, but not alone. Not this time. For a moment, Gideon looked torn, his jaw tight. Then he nodded once. Stay close to Clara. If anything happens, nothing will happen. Eleanor cut him off. Not while we're together. The rider approached, slow, deliberate, his horse's hooves striking the frozen ground like a drumbeat. When he reached the yard, he swung down, tying the reins loosely to the fence as if he had all the time in the world. Danner's smile was thin, cruel. Evening hail. Gideon stepped forward, rifle steady. You should have stayed in that cell. Danner chuckled. Cells can't hold a man who knows how to slip a lock. Besides, unfinished business has a way of dragging a man back. His eyes slid to Eleanor, then to the window, where Clara's face peeked out wide and fearful, especially when the little one remembers more than she should. Eleanor's stomach turned. She stepped closer to Gideon, her chin high. You murdered her mother. You tried to silence the only witness. That's why you're here. Danner's smile faltered for the briefest instant. Then he sneered. I did what needed doing. Eliza never should have gotten in my way. Neither should you. Before Gideon could answer, Clara burst through the door with a cry. Mama! Her small voice cracked the silence like a shot. Eleanor grabbed her, pulling her close, but the word had already broken something inside Gideon. His eyes filled with fire, his grip tightening on the rifle. You don't touch my family, he growled. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the yard exploded into motion. Danner lunged his knife, flashing in the last light of day. Gideon fired the shot, cracking across the plains. The bullet grazed Danner's arm, spinning him, but the man didn't fall. He charged, knife raised, slashing with fury. Eleanor shoved Clara behind her and snatched the fallen rifle from the porch wall. Her hands trembled, but her aim held true. Stop, she cried. Danner froze, eyes flicking between Gideon's rifle and Eleanor's. His sneer twisted into a snarl. You think you can shoot me, lady? You can't even bear a child, and you think you can bear killing a man? The words cut like ice, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She steadied the barrel. I can bear whatever I must to protect her. For a long moment, none of them moved. The air was thick with breath and fear, the horses stamping nervously at the fence. Then Gideon stepped forward, his voice hard as iron. You're done, Danner. This ends here. Danner's eyes narrowed. His hand twitched on the knife. Clara whimpered, clutching Eleanor's skirt. Papa! The single word shattered the last of Gideon's restraint. He moved. The yard erupted in chaos. Gideon lunged his rifle, swinging like a club, striking Danner's knife arm with bone-cracking force. The blade clattered into the mud, spinning away. Danner roared, staggering back, his free hand clutching his wrist. But he didn't fall. Like a cornered wolf, he came back twice as vicious, throwing himself at Gideon with a snarl. The two men collided, fists pounding boots, slipping on thawing earth. Gideon's strength was raw, fueled by 3 years of guilt and rage, but Danner fought like a man who lived for cruelty. Each blow landed with the sound of breaking wood. Eleanor stood frozen for a breath. Clara's small hands clutching her skirt, the child's wide eyes begging her to stop the nightmare. Eleanor snapped into motion. She dragged Clara behind her, shoved her back through the door, and slammed it shut. Stay inside, she cried, locking eyes with the girl. No matter what you hear, stay inside. She turned back just as Danner slammed Gideon against the fence. The wood splintered. Gideon's breath left him in a grunt, but he drove his knee up hard, knocking Danner off balance. They grappled in the mud fists, flying breaths tearing the cold air. Eleanor ran to the fallen knife. Her fingers closed around its cross-hatched handle. The weight of it seared her palm. She aimed it, her voice trembling but clear. Enough! Danner froze his lip, split blood dripping down his chin. His eyes flicked to the blade in her hand, then to Gideon. Slowly, a twisted smile spread across his bruised face. Well, look at that, he rasped. She's got some fight after all. He spat blood into the dirt and took a step closer. Eleanor tightened her grip. Her stomach roiled, but she didn't lower the blade. One more step, and I'll finish what Gideon started. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Danner's face. His sneer faltered. He glanced at Gideon, still crouched, breathing hard, his eyes burning with fury. Then he looked back at Eleanor, seeing not the frightened woman who had walked up to the wrong ranch weeks ago, but someone different, someone unyielding. "You won't do it," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I will." Eleanor answered, her hand steady. "Because she calls me Mama now, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe." The silence that followed was sharp as glass. Gideon used it. He surged upward, grabbing Danner by the collar, and drove him hard into the mud. His fist came down once, twice, 3 times until Danner stopped struggling. The world narrowed to breath and blood. Gideon knelt over the man, his chest heaving, his fist dripping red. Eleanor stepped closer. Knife still in her hand, her whole body shaking. "Gideon," she whispered, his head lifted, his eyes wild. Slowly the storm in them receded. He looked down at Danner, unconscious in the dirt, and then up at Eleanor. His breath shuddered out of him. "It's over," she said. He nodded once, then collapsed backward into the mud. The fight drained out of him. Eleanor dropped the knife, rushing to his side. She pressed her hands to his face, rough and bruised, and he leaned into her touch like a drowning man finding shore. From the doorway, Clara peeked out, her small frame trembling. Eleanor beckoned her. The child ran across the yard, flinging herself into Gideon's arms. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "It's done, Peanut," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He'll never hurt you again." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Papa?" She whispered, her voice small but certain. Gideon's arms tightened. His eyes met Eleanor's over the child's head, and in them she saw something she hadn't dared hope for. Not just relief, not just gratitude, but love, steady and unshakable. Neighbors arrived within the hour, drawn by the sound of gunfire and shouts. They found Danner bound, battered, his face swollen. Gideon handed him over without ceremony, his voice flat. "He's yours. See that justice is done." The sheriff's men took him, muttering about gallows and overdue reckonings. But for Gideon, Eleanor, and Clara, the trial no longer mattered. Their justice had been found here in the yard, where the truth had been forced into the light. That night, when the house settled back into silence, Eleanor sat by the fire with Clara asleep in her lap. Gideon lowered himself into the chair across from her, his body bruised, his spirit exhausted. For a long time they said nothing. The crackle of the flames was enough. Finally, Gideon spoke, his voice rough. "I thought I'd buried myself with Eliza. I thought I didn't deserve to live, not after what happened. But you—" His throat closed. He forced the words out. "You gave me back a reason." Eleanor's eyes filled. She looked down at Clara, curled against her, breathing softly, and then back at Gideon. "We gave each other back a reason." The firelight danced over them, sealing the moment. For the first time since she had arrived, Eleanor felt no storm pressing at the windows, no shadows creeping at the edges of the room. Only warmth, only peace. And in that peace a family had been born. The days after Danner's capture passed in a strange quiet. The valley still whispered about the fight, about Gideon Hale finally facing the man who had haunted his house for 3 years. Neighbors came by offering food help or just long looks, filled with something Gideon had not felt from them in years: respect, instead of suspicion. But inside the house, life shifted in gentler ways. Clara slept sounder now, no longer waking at every creak. She began to hum when she played small tunes half remembered from lullabies Eliza must have once sung. Eleanor sat with her at the table, guiding her hand through crooked stitches, laughing softly at every tangle of thread. One evening, Clara looked up from her work, eyes bright, and whispered, "Mama, it's pretty." Eleanor's throat tightened. She kissed the top of the girl's head. "It's beautiful, sweetheart, just like you." Across the room, Gideon heard the words. His hand stilled on the piece of harness he was mending. He looked at them. Eleanor bent over the child, Clara smiling up at her, and for the first time in years, his heart didn't ache from absence. It swelled with something new. Yet Eleanor's doubts still gnawed at her. When she walked alone in the mornings, her thoughts circled back to the same wound: she could never bear children. She feared Gideon's kindness would eventually harden into regret. One night, as the wind pressed against the walls, she sat by the fire, staring into the embers. Gideon entered quietly, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. He set one beside her and lowered himself into the chair. "You've been far away tonight," he said. She hesitated, then whispered, "I'm afraid of not being enough. Afraid that one day you'll look at me and see only what I cannot give you." Gideon leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on hers. "Eleanor, do you know what I see?" She shook her head. "I see the woman who carried Clara out of silence, the woman who faced Danner with a knife in her hand and didn't blink, the woman who walked into my storm and taught me how to breathe again." Her eyes stung. "But no." His voice was firm, steady. "Eliza gave me Clara. You gave me back myself, and you gave Clara a mother when she thought she would never have one again. That is more than enough." Eleanor's tears spilled freely then. She reached for his hand. He took it, rough fingers closing over hers, and for a moment the silence between them was not emptiness. It was promise. Spring deepened. The first green shoots pushed through thawed earth. Gideon worked the fields, Eleanor planted her garden, and Clara followed them both like a shadow, laughing more freely each day. But life was not done testing them. Word arrived from town Danner had confessed in his cell, not from remorse, but out of rage. He bragged about killing Eliza, about how Gideon had been too drunk to notice, about how the sheriff had buried the truth to protect his cousin. The sheriff resigned in disgrace. Danner was sentenced to hang. When Gideon brought the news home, Eleanor sat very still. Clara, sitting on the floor, looked up with wide eyes. Gideon crouched beside his daughter, brushing her hair back. "He can't hurt you anymore, Peanut," he said softly. Clara nodded, but then she crawled into Eleanor's lap, curling against her. "Mama, you stay forever?" she whispered. Eleanor's arms wrapped around her tightly. "Forever, my darling. Nothing will take me from you." Gideon watched them, his chest heavy, his eyes burning. For the first time since Eliza's death, the past loosened its grip. Weeks later, the valley gathered in town to watch Danner hang. Gideon and Eleanor did not bring Clara. Instead, they stood together at the edge of the crowd, Eleanor's hand locked in his. The rope snapped. The man who had haunted their nights was gone. When it was over, Gideon looked at Eleanor. "It's finished," she shook her head softly. "No, Gideon, it's begun." They returned home to find Clara waiting on the porch, her doll in her arms, her face breaking into a smile when she saw them. She ran forward, calling out the word that had changed everything. "Mama." Papa Eleanor knelt, catching the child in her arms, her heart so full it threatened to burst. Gideon crouched beside them, his arms folding around them both. The storm that had haunted their lives was gone, and in its place stood something fragile, fierce, and true, a family chosen not by blood, but by love. The weeks after Danner's hanging carried a strange lightness, like the valley itself had exhaled. The shadows seemed thinner, the silence softer. Yet the Hale Ranch did not slip back into its old rhythms, it built new ones. Every morning, Clara woke early, padding down the stairs in bare feet to find Eleanor already in the kitchen. Sometimes she brought her doll, sometimes just her sleepy smile, but always she tugged at Eleanor's skirt and whispered, "Mama, help." Together they kneaded bread or stirred porridge flour, dusting their hands, laughter filling corners that had known only grief. Gideon would appear from the barn, shoulders dusted with hay, his face softening at the sight. He had once walked into this house braced for silence. Now he walked in braced for the sound of Clara's giggle and Eleanor's voice humming as she worked. It was new, it was fragile, and it was theirs. One evening, Gideon returned from town with a parcel tucked under his arm. Eleanor looked up from her mending as he entered, curiosity lighting her eyes. "What's that?" she asked. He set it on the table, unwrapping the paper to reveal a book of hymns, the cover worn but whole. The piano's been silent too long. Eleanor's breath caught. She touched the cover reverently. "I don't play well." "You'll learn," Gideon said simply. He glanced toward Clara, who had crept closer, her wide eyes fixed on the book. "She should grow up with music in her house." The word struck Eleanor deep. Not Eliza's house, not even his house, her house, their house. That night, Eleanor lifted the piano lid and stumbled through the first hymn. Her fingers faltered, the keys cracked with age, but Gideon's rough voice joined hers, steadying the sound. Clara climbed onto the bench beside her, banging on the lower notes, her laughter ringing like bells. The music was clumsy and perfect, but it was alive. Still, the ghosts were not fully gone. One afternoon, Eleanor found Gideon standing at the fence, Eliza's ring glinting on his finger. He was staring at the horizon, his face unreadable. "Does it hurt wearing it still?" she asked quietly. He turned startled. His gaze dropped to the ring. Slowly he twisted it, sliding it from his finger. For a long moment he held it in his palm, his thumb brushing the worn gold. "She was my beginning," he said softly. "But you're what came after the end." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Gideon." He closed her hand around the ring, pressing it into her palm. "Can't ask you to wear it, but I can ask you to keep it, because it means I didn't stop living." Her eyes blurred with tears. She nodded, clutching the ring against her chest. "Then I'll keep it. Not as a memory of what was lost, but as a promise of what we've found." That night, Gideon took Eleanor and Clara for a walk to the creek. The snow had melted the water, rushing bright in cold sunlight, spilling golden over the hills. Clara skipped between them, holding both their hands. At the water's edge, Gideon stopped. His hand trembled as he reached into his coat. From a small velvet pouch, he pulled a simple band, worn but steady. "I wore this too long," he said, lifting his hand to show the space where Eliza's ring had been. Then he looked at Eleanor, his voice soft. "She's gone. I loved her. But loving her doesn't mean I stopped living." Eleanor's breath caught. "Emmy needs a mother," Gideon continued. "And I need you." His voice cracked. "Family isn't about where we come from. It's about where we choose to stay. I choose you, Eleanor Sinclair. Will you marry me?" Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, pulling Clara close between them. Her tears spilled freely as she whispered, "I thought I'd missed my chance to belong, that I was only good at leaving. But if you'll have me, yes, I'll marry you." Clara clapped her hands, her face shining. "Mama, stay forever." Gideon slid the ring onto Eleanor's finger. Their hands closed over Clara's small one, binding them in a circle, unbroken by blood or loss. The creek rushed on. The sun glowed gold, and the storm that had once ruled their lives was gone. In its place, a vow was made. The church in Fort Bridger had never held a wedding quite like it. It was simple, hurried in its preparations, yet when the day came, the pews filled as though the whole town knew they were witnesses to something larger than vows. Word had spread of Eleanor Sinclair, the woman who had bled to shield a child not her own, and of Gideon Hale, the rancher, who had carried guilt for years until the truth was finally dragged into light. Wildflowers lined the aisle, their colors clashing, but bright gathered by the neighbor women that morning. The scent of lilac and sage hung in the air. Gideon stood at the altar, wearing his best shirt, though his hands betrayed him by clenching and unclenching at his sides. His storm-gray eyes scanned the church until they found Clara in her blue dress scattering petals down the aisle, her smile wide, her step certain. Then the doors opened. Eleanor entered, her dress borrowed from the seamstress in town, her hair pinned with sprigs of lavender. She walked slowly, each step a reminder of the wound that had nearly taken her life, but her eyes never left Gideon. When the preacher asked who gave the bride away, Clara stood tall, chin high. "I do," she declared. Laughter rippled through the pews, followed by a hush that settled as vows were spoken. Gideon's voice cracked as he said the words. "I promise you, Eleanor, that you'll never face another storm alone. You gave me back my life. You gave Clara back her voice. I swear before God in this valley I will spend the rest of my days proving I am worthy of what you've given us." Eleanor's tears glistened, her voice soft but steady. "I wasn't born to be a mother, but I was called to become one. You are my choice, Gideon Hale, and Clara is my heart. This family is my vow." The preacher smiled, his own voice thick with emotion. "By the authority given me, I declare you husband and wife." Gideon bent, pressing his lips to Eleanor's with a reverence that carried both grief and hope, as though sealing not only their future, but their survival. Clara darted forward, wrapping her arms around them both, laughter bubbling up like music. The three of them stood together, framed by light spilling through the old windows, no longer broken souls, but a family. The celebration afterward spilled into the churchyard. The townsfolk brought pies, roasted meats, even a fiddler who struck up a tune that carried into the hills. Children ran in circles, their shouts bright as bells. Clara clung to Eleanor's hand, proud to show her off, whispering "Mama" to anyone who would listen, as though she feared the word might vanish if she didn't share it. Gideon stood near, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, his face relaxed in a way she had never seen before. He looked lighter, not because he had forgotten his past, but because he had finally laid it down. "Feels strange," he murmured to her, "to stand here and not feel the weight pressing down." She leaned into him, her voice soft. "That's not strange, Gideon. That's grace." He kissed her temple, his lips lingering. "Then grace is ours." That night they returned to the ranch. The fire glowed low in the hearth, casting golden light across the room. Clara had fallen asleep between them on the wagon ride home, her doll tucked beneath her chin. Gideon carried her inside, laying her gently in bed, his hands trembling as he tucked the quilt around her. When he returned to Eleanor, he found her standing at the mantel. Eliza's portrait still hung there, but now it was joined by Clara's newest drawing, 3 figures holding hands under a sun labeled in a child's careful letters. Mama, Papa, me. Eleanor's hand rested on the drawing. "She's given us her word too," she whispered. Gideon came to her side, slipping his arm around her. "Then it's sealed." For a long while they stood in silence, listening to the steady rhythm of Clara's breathing upstairs, the soft crackle of the fire, the creak of the timbers. The storm that had once ruled their lives was gone. What remained was peace. As the flames dimmed, Eleanor lay beside Clara, whispering words she had once doubted she could ever say, "I am yours." Forever. Gideon settled into the chair by the fire, his eyes heavy, his body weary, but his heart steady. For the first time in years, he closed his eyes and felt safe. The house that had once been filled with grief now breathed with something else entirely. Life, laughter, and love chosen not by fate, but by courage. The weeks after the wedding unfolded like the first breaths of spring, slow, hesitant, but alive. Snow melted into streams that cut the valley into ribbons of silver. Grass pushed up through the thawing earth, and the air carried the scent of pine and wet soil. For the first time in years, the Hale Ranch sounded less like an echo of grief and more like a home. Clara filled the house with her laughter. She skipped from room to room, her doll always in tow, her voice growing steadier with each word she dared speak. She called Eleanor Mama at every chance, as though she wanted to hear it echo in the rafters. And Gideon, once a man whose shoulders bent under invisible weight, stood taller, his eyes softer. The neighbors noticed. They came by with smiles instead of whispers, their children running with Clara in the yard as though a shadow had lifted from the land. One evening, Eleanor sat by the fire, Clara's head heavy against her lap, when Gideon approached with a small box in his hands. He opened it to reveal Eliza's wedding ring. Its gold glowed faint in the firelight, worn smooth by years. "I kept it because I was afraid to forget," Gideon said quietly. "But I was wrong. Forgetting isn't the danger. The danger was never living again." Eleanor's throat tightened. "What do you want me to do with it?" "Keep it," he answered, placing it in her palm. "Not as a chain. As a reminder that love doesn't end, it changes. Eliza gave me Clara. You gave me Clara back, and you gave me yourself. That's more than I ever thought I'd be given twice in one lifetime." Eleanor closed her fingers over the ring tears shimmering in her eyes. "Then I'll keep it. Not for what we lost, but for what we've found." Weeks turned to months. The ranch thrived. Eleanor's garden bloomed. Gideon's herd grew strong, and Clara's drawings filled the walls. Bright suns, green meadows, 3 stick figures always holding hands. At the bottom of one, she scrawled clumsy letters. "My family." One summer night, as stars scattered like silver dust across the sky, the 3 of them walked to the ridge. The valley stretched below, vast and wild, but for once it did not feel cruel. It felt like promise. Clara held both their hands, her small fingers binding them together. "Mama," she whispered. "Papa, we stay here forever." Eleanor knelt, brushing a curl from her cheek. "Forever, sweetheart. This is home." Gideon looked out over the land, his arm wrapping around them both. His voice was steady, deep. "Storms will come again, But they won't break us. Not anymore. Clara squeezed their hands, smiling at the horizon. And in that moment, beneath the endless Montana sky, the three of them stood as more than survivors of sorrow. They stood as a family chosen, tested, and bound by a love strong enough to turn silence into laughter, grief into grace, and a storm into shelter. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the chill of a Montana winter, the warmth of a love hard-earned, and the power of a little girl's first word, then you are the reason we tell these stories. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.